Take this discussion further now. We're joined by the Deputy Director General for Mineral and for specifically petroleum regulations at the South African Department of Mineral and Petroleum Resources, Tseliso Maqubela, as well as the CEO of the Road Freight Association, Gavin. DDG Tseliso, I want to begin the conversation with you this evening. How sensitive is South Africa to supply chains disruptions, particularly in the Strait of Hormuz, and what are the shock absorbers that we have in place to those disruptions?
Okay, good evening, Oliver, and as well as the viewers. Also, good evening to Gavin. So, firstly, let me just say that we are not as exposed to the Middle East as we used to. In 2010, 2011, we divested a lot of our supply, which came from the Middle East. And effectively, currently, 60% of our supply comes from the African continent. So our exposure is not as much.
So we certainly still buy oil at rates set on the open market, or do we have very specific supply agreements with the countries that we buy oil from to ensure that price volatility doesn't affect us as adversely?
No, in terms of price, Oliver, I think it is clear we will be affected by the volatility. Already we're seeing that for April, we're not looking very good. So this conflict really has to come to an end as soon as possible.
Yeah. Just very importantly, in 2015, the then Minister of Energy had sold off South Africa's oil reserves, about 10 million barrels of oil that was in reserve. Has there been an attempt to replenish those reserves since then?
So I think we've said this before. We were able to recover all of those barrels that were sold, and money went back to the people that had bought that oil. So effectively, we refunded them. As we speak now, there is oil in tank, and so we'll be able to carry the economy for a while going forward. But I think the big thing is the price. As we saw when the Russia-Ukraine war started, the price is the one that tends to have an impact on the economy.
Yeah, just very quickly, and I think this is really important to establish, pertaining very specifically to those reserves. It was 10 million barrels then that was kept in reserve. What are the volumes in reserve at the moment?
Okay, so what has happened, we have been selling some of them to the local refiners. But I must say that at the moment, we have got in-tank usable about 8 million barrels.
Okay. Gavin, I want to bring you into the conversation very quickly. During COVID-19, of course, when there was a global inflationary impact as a result of disruptions to supply chains, then one of the mechanisms that was considered and implemented by the National Treasury was to temporarily suspend the fuel levy that consumers at the pump paid to give some form of relief. Of course, it was a temporary situation. It wasn't permanent. We're back to paying that fuel levy. Is that something that you would implore the National Treasury and perhaps Cabinet to consider implementing once again if price volatility becomes so drastic that it impacts us in an incredibly adversely incalculable way?
Good evening, Oliver. Good evening to your viewers, and good evening, Tseliso. That's a very good question, because if we look at what happened when the Ukrainian war started, oil went to above $100 a barrel. And you can just imagine, with the rand having about 1.5%. If we carry on that trajectory, we're going to be in a very, very tight spot. So Treasury is going to have to look at how it can help the local economy, and cutting back on the fuel levy is a short-term option. But you see, after a couple of years, you have to get back to raising that levy. So I think there are a number of issues that we need to look at. One of them, in a long-term view, and that's what we said in 2019, is we have to look at becoming far less reliant on these sorts of oil's ups and downs. We have to look at generating our own oil or finding cheaper markets for oil within Africa itself.
Yeah, that's an incredibly important intervention. Tseliso, I want to bring you back into the conversation. Of course, we understand that the Orange Basin has become quite litigious, which means that South Africa's oil resources really aren't being utilized, at least in the upstream as it is. We're a largely midstream and downstream economy, which means we refine and we sell off end products. We're not really exploring as we should. It's caught up in litigation. The intervention by Gavin is quite astute. What's your response to that?
Well, we've said all along that we have sufficient oil in the country, especially in the Orange Basin, and we really have to do whatever it takes to get that oil out of the ground, because it is going to benefit us. And we can, if we had started exploring the Orange Basin now, we would actually be having a buffer that can then be used by way of crude oil that can then cushion the consumer. Currently, we don't have that. And I think we have to think as South Africans, how do we begin to be energy independent?
Yeah.
We have that opportunity, but I think the opposition to oil and gas is really, disadvantaging citizens.
Is there anything that the price regulator can do right now about the tariff structure around oil pricing, particularly what consumers pay at the pump, that can give some form of temporary relief?
Look, I think we've squeezed the margin that are due to the oil company to the bare minimum. Our fuel is very competitive in terms of pricing for a country that currently does not produce oil. You just have to look at where we sit globally. We are very competitive, and I think that we have really done everything. We've removed things that were there because of our legacy. However, we always are in the lookout for opportunities to squeeze even more.
Yeah.
But I think the important thing currently is to make sure that there is supply. And in as far as crude oil is concerned, at the moment we don't have a concern because most of our oil, as I said, comes from Nigeria and Angola. But the issue, as we are discussing, is the price.
Yeah. Gavin, do you have some ideas, perhaps, about how to squeeze that tariff structure even further?
I think it's so tight, Oliver. I think Tseliso has probably got to closest to the bone that they can, that Treasury would be able to, or that the country would be able to. One of the things we mustn't forget, whilst we move away from coal-fired fire stations or electricity, is that we've got so much coal in this country. And a couple of years ago, we created oil. Sasol was created to make fuel out of coal. So we must look at that and perhaps blending that into far more standard petroleum, crude oil-based products. And perhaps that would help us with the tariff.
Yeah. Is there anything in the pipeline, Tseliso, in easing some of the regulatory hurdles around very specifically biofuels as an interim structure?
Well, biofuels, yeah. So in as far as biofuels is concerned, we've got projects in the pipeline. There is one project that we believe will soon be reaching financial close. And we should be able to get biofuels in our fuel pool in the near future. But of course, it is not going to help us in this immediate future. And this has been enabled because there's a regulation that was promulgated last year, and biofuels investors have found it quite, enabling. And so they are busy with projects, to basically roll out biofuels in the country.
Yeah, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. That's the Deputy Director General for Petroleum Regulation at the South African Department of Mineral and Petroleum Resources, Tseliso Maqubela, as well as the CEO of the Road Freight Association, Gavin.